I spent 31 years working fraud investigations for the federal government. And in all that time, I never once lost sleep over a case. I'd seen embezzlers, con artists, men who stole pension funds from widows and slept soundly every night. I'd built cases that sent people away for decades. I thought I was done feeling anything sharp about other people's crimes. Then my son-in-law hit my daughter at my Thanksgiving table, and I felt something I hadn't felt since I was 22 years old, and watching a man hurt someone who couldn't fight back. I didn't reach for a weapon. I didn't lunge across the table. I reached into my shirt pocket, pulled out my phone, and scrolled to a name I hadn't dialed in 9 years. He had absolutely no idea what I'd just set in motion. My daughter Megan had been with Travis Weston for 6 years, married for 4 of them. They lived 40 minutes north of us, in a house he'd bought with money from his first restaurant, a barbecue place outside of Knoxville that did well enough he opened a second, then a third. By the time he and Megan got married, he had 4 locations and a 5th in development. He talked about it constantly, at dinner, at holidays, during conversations that had nothing to do with restaurants. My wife, Linda, used to catch my eye across the table when he started in on revenue projections and square footage negotiations, and I'd give her a small nod that meant, yes, I hear him too. Just let it go. I never liked Travis. I want to be honest about that. He wasn't a bad-looking man, and he could be charming when he wanted something, but I'd spent 3 decades learning to read people, and what I read in Travis Weston was a man who believed the rules applied to everyone except him. Little things. The way he'd correct Megan in public, gently but consistently, like she needed managing. The way he'd talk over her when she was mid-sentence and then smile at her like he'd done her a favor by finishing her thought. The way he'd reference her income. She was a physical therapist, good at her work, well-respected, as something quaint. Megan's little salary, he called it once. Just once, because I looked at him and something in my face made him decide not to say it again. Megan loved him, or she loved who she thought he was when they met, which I suppose is the same thing in the beginning. She's my only child, and she has my stubbornness, which meant that when Linda and I expressed concerns over the years, she heard criticism instead of worry. We learned to be careful. We learned to be present and keep the door open rather than push, because pushing would only drive her further in. So we hosted Thanksgiving every year. We made the turkey. Linda made her sweet potato casserole and her mother's cornbread stuffing, and we sat around the table in the house where Megan grew up and tried to be a family. Travis's parents came some years. His brother Daniel came most years. Daniel was 3 years younger than Travis and had worked for him since the second restaurant opened. He managed 2 of the locations and worshipped his brother, the way younger siblings sometimes worship the one who got out first and built something. It was a loyalty that had no bottom and no conditions, which is a dangerous thing in a person. That Thursday in November, Linda had been cooking since 6 in the morning. The house smelled the way it only smells on Thanksgiving, butter and sage, and the particular warmth of an oven that's been running all day. My granddaughter Sophie, who had just turned 7, was sitting on the kitchen counter eating crescent rolls before dinner, while Linda pretended not to notice. Megan was helping set the table. I was in the living room with Daniel, watching football and not talking much, which suited us both. Travis came in from the garage around 3. He'd driven separately from Megan, which he sometimes did when he was coming from one of the restaurants. He poured himself a drink without asking if anyone else wanted one, checked his phone for a solid 2 minutes standing in the middle of the kitchen, and then sat down at the table before Linda had finished bringing things out. I watched him do all of this from the doorway. Dinner started well enough. Sophie wanted to say what she was thankful for, so we went around the table. Linda said, family. I said, health, and the people at the table. Daniel said, Travis, which made Travis grin. Megan said, Sophie, and then looked at Travis, and he was already looking at his phone again. It was Linda's cornbread stuffing that started it. Travis took a bite, set his fork down, and said it tasted different. Linda said she'd used a little less sage this year, because Sophie had said it was too strong last Thanksgiving. Travis said he preferred it the original way and that it was a shame to change a recipe that worked. Linda said she'd keep that in mind. Megan said the stuffing was delicious. Travis looked at her. He said, you would think so. You've never had a particularly refined palate. The table went quiet. Sophie was looking at her plate. Linda had stopped serving. I set down my glass, Megan said quietly. That's not a nice thing to say. Travis put his fork down again, and something changed in his face. That particular change I'd seen before in interviews, the moment a person stops performing patience. He said, "I'm just being honest. You've always been." Megan said, "Don't." He said her name, sharp, like a correction. She looked up at him and said, "I asked you not to do this today. I asked you specifically." I didn't know what she was referring to, but it was clear there was a conversation that had happened before this one, something carried in from outside the house. Travis said, "You want to talk about asking? You want to talk about what I've asked?" And then he said something about money. Their money. A joint account. A withdrawal he'd apparently found out about. And his voice was rising, and Linda put her hand on the table like she was steadying herself. And Sophie was very still, and I was already pushing back my chair. Megan said, "That money is mine. I earned it. And I am not doing this in front of—" I don't know exactly how to describe the next 2 seconds, except to say that it happened faster than anger usually moves. Travis's hand came across the table, open palm to the side of her face. Not a slap, the way people minimize slaps. A hit. The kind that snapped her head sideways and knocked her fork off her plate. Sophie screamed. Linda made a sound I have never heard her make before, and hope to never hear again. Megan had both hands over her face. I was standing. I don't remember standing, but I was on my feet. Daniel said, "Travis," in a warning voice, like his concern was about what would happen to Travis, not what had just happened to my daughter. Here's the thing about 31 years in federal investigation. You learn to manage the space between what you feel and what you do. You learn that the action you take in the first 30 seconds of a crisis determines everything that comes after. I wanted to do something that I am not going to describe. I was 63 years old, and I wanted to do it anyway. And the only thing that stopped me was knowing, with the certainty of a man who has watched people destroy their own cases in exactly this moment, that if I did it, I would hand Travis Weston a way out. I went to Megan instead. I put my hands on her shoulders, and she was shaking. I said, "Sophie, go with Grandma." Linda had already come around the table. She took Sophie's hand and walked her toward the back bedroom without a word. Sophie was crying. Linda's face was a thing I won't describe. Daniel said, "Look, this is a family matter. Let's all just." I said, "Daniel, sit down and don't speak again." He sat down. Travis was standing now. He was doing what men like that do in the moment after, calculating, watching to see how bad it was going to be, preparing the version of events he'd need. He said, "She provoked." I said, "I'm going to need you to stop talking." He said, "Robert." He always used my name when he wanted to remind me he didn't need my approval. I said, "My name is not Robert to you. Not anymore." I looked at him for a moment. "You need to leave my house." He said I needed to understand the context. He said Megan had been making financial decisions without him, that he had found out about money moved from a joint account, that he had been patient for months. He said patient, like it was something he deserved credit for. I said, "In about 60 seconds, I'm calling the police. I'm also calling someone else. I suggest you leave before I make either call." Daniel said, "Come on, this is family. We can work this out." I looked at him, and he stopped. Travis lifted Megan, who was sitting with a dish towel pressed to her face and her eyes on the tablecloth. He said, "Megan, tell your father this doesn't need to involve anyone else." She didn't say anything. He said her name again. She still didn't answer. I watched something shift in her in that silence. Not a dramatic shift. Not a sudden one. The kind of shift that had probably been building for years and just finally ran out of room to hold. Travis grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair. He said something under his breath that I didn't catch and didn't want to. Daniel followed him to the door. I heard them talking quietly in the entryway for about 30 seconds, and then the door opened and closed. I sat down across from my daughter. She said, "I'm sorry." I said, "Don't." She said, "He's been under a lot of pressure." The 5th location fell through in the bank. I said, "Megan, look at me." She looked at me. Her eye was already beginning to swell. I said, nothing that happened tonight was your fault, and nothing he is under gives him the right to put his hand on you. Not today, not any day. That is the only thing I need you to hear right now. She started to cry then, the way people cry when they've been holding something for a very long time and something finally gives. I held her hand and let her. After a while, I heard Linda come back down the hall without Sophie, which meant Sophie was settled somewhere with the television. Linda sat down next to Megan and didn't say anything, just put her arm around her. I stood up. I walked to the window in the kitchen, and I took out my phone. I scrolled to a contact I last called 9 years ago, when I was wrapping up my final case before retirement, and needed a favor from someone who had spent 20 years at the IRS Criminal Investigation Division before moving into private forensic accounting. His name was Gary Paulson. We'd worked a procurement fraud case together in 2009, and I'd helped him in a way that mattered to him. And he had told me then that if I ever needed anything, the door was open. I called Gary. He picked up on the second ring. I said, Gary, it's Frank Callahan. He said, Frank Callahan. He said, Frank, it's been a long time. There was noise in the background, family noise, which told me I'd reached him in the middle of his own Thanksgiving. I said, I know what day it is, and I'm sorry for calling. I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me if it's a door you can open. He said, tell me. I told him Travis Weston's name. I told him about the restaurant group. I told him that I had a hunch, based on years of reading people and a few things I'd noticed over 4 years of watching this man operate, that the books on those restaurants were not clean. I told him what had just happened at my table. Gary was quiet for a moment. Then he said, how clean do you need this to be? I said, I need it to be real. I'm not looking to manufacture something. If there's nothing there, you call me back and tell me that and we're done. He said, give me a week. I said, take 2. We hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a moment. Through the window, I could see the backyard where Megan used to play when she was Sophie's age, where I'd pushed her on a swing set that was long gone now. The November light was almost gone. I went back to my daughter. The next morning, Megan called me from our guest room, where she and Sophie had stayed the night. She said Travis had texted her 4 times. The texts went from apology to explanation to something that looked a lot like blame. She read me one of them, and I listened without commenting, because what I wanted to say would not have been useful. I asked her if she'd spoken to anyone. She said she'd called her friend Carla. I said that was good. I asked about Sophie, who had apparently slept through the night after a long conversation with Linda about big feelings and how some grown-ups make very bad choices. My wife has a gift I've never fully been able to explain. Megan asked me what I was going to do. I said, I made a call last night. I want you to let me see where it goes. She said, Dad. I said, I'm not going to do anything that hurts you or Sophie. You have my word on that. What I'm going to do is find out whether Travis Weston is who he presents himself to be. Because, in my experience, men who behave the way he behaved last night rarely limit that behavior to one area of their life. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, He moved money, Dad, from the restaurant accounts. I found statements by accident 6 weeks ago. That's what the fight was about. I confronted him and he said it was a tax strategy and I didn't know what I was talking about. I said, Did you keep the statements? She said, I photographed them. There are moments when I look at my daughter and see myself so clearly it almost hurts. I said, Send them to me. She sent them within the minute. I forwarded them to Gary with a message that said, Starting point. 10 days later, Gary called me back. He asked if I was somewhere I could talk. I stepped out to the back porch with a cup of coffee. He said, Your instincts are not wrong. What Gary had found, working through public records, industry contacts, and a conversation with a former employee of the restaurant group who turned out to be remarkably forthcoming, was the beginning of something that went considerably further than I'd expected. Travis Weston had been running a cash skimming operation across all 4 locations for at least 3 years. It wasn't sophisticated. It rarely is, with restaurant owners, because restaurants deal in enough daily cash that a consistent skim can go unnoticed for a long time if no one is specifically looking. But it was consistent, and it was substantial. Conservative estimates put it in the low seven figures over the 3-year period Gary could document. That alone would have been enough. But Gary had also found something else. A former kitchen manager named Darnell, who had been let go from the Knoxville location 14 months prior, under circumstances Darnell described as retaliatory. He had raised concerns about prep practices that were creating health code issues and had been fired within the week. Darnell had filed a complaint that had been reviewed and, Gary suspected, had not received the attention it deserved. Gary had connected Darnell with an employment attorney who believed the retaliation case was strong. And then there was the fifth location, the one Travis had told Megan fell through because of bank financing. It hadn't fallen through because of bank financing. It had fallen through because the commercial landlord had backed out after receiving information. Gary was still running this down, suggesting that Travis had falsified revenue documentation submitted as part of the lease application, which was fraud, clear, documentable, the kind that commercial landlords pursue aggressively because it protects future tenants and their own liability. I sat on my porch and drank my coffee and listened to Gary lay all of this out in the careful, methodical way of a man who spent 2 decades making sure cases were airtight before anyone moved. I said, "How do we proceed?" He said, "I have a contact at the Tennessee Department of Revenue who takes a particular interest in hospitality industry tax evasion. I also have a relationship with an attorney who handles whistleblower cases and would want to talk to Darnell. And I think your daughter needs to speak to a family attorney in the next 72 hours. I said, "The financial accounts, the joint ones." Gary said, "She should speak to an attorney today, Frank, not tomorrow." I called Megan as soon as I hung up with Gary. I told her she needed to see a family law attorney before the end of the week. I didn't tell her everything yet. I told her that what I'd found suggested Travis had been less than honest about the state of the business, and that she needed to protect herself and Sophie before any of what was coming became public. She asked me what was coming. I said, "An accounting." She was quiet. Then she said, "He's going to say I set this up. He's going to say I'd been trying to destroy him." I said, "Megan, he hit you at my table in front of your daughter. Whatever comes next, that is where this started. Not with me. Not with you. Him." She called an attorney named Patricia Holt, who came recommended by a colleague at the PT practice, and who turned out to be exactly the kind of attorney I'd want across the table if I were in a dispute. Thorough, unsentimental, and someone who clearly had seen enough cases, like Megan's, to be neither surprised nor slowed down. Patricia moved quickly. She filed for separation and issued a formal notice that preserved Megan's interest in all joint financial assets, which meant Travis could not move money from the joint accounts without triggering an immediate legal response. When he tried, and Patricia told Megan later that he tried within 36 hours of receiving the notice, the alert went off exactly as it was designed to. Travis called me. It was a Saturday morning, 12 days after Thanksgiving. I was in the garage. I saw his name on my phone and let it ring twice, then answered. He said, "I don't know what you think you're doing." I said, "Good morning, Travis." He said, "You've been talking to people. I have a business. I have employees. I have employees. I have said, 4 restaurants." "I know." He said, "You have no idea what you're messing with." "I have lawyers, and I will." I said, "Travis, I spent 31 years investigating financial fraud for the federal government. I retired at a GS-15 level. I have relationships at IRS Criminal Investigation, at the Department of Revenue, and at the FBI field office in Knoxville from a cooperative case we ran in 2014. The people I have spoken to are not people I had to convince of anything. I simply showed them what was already there." Silence. I said, "I want you to understand something. I did not do this because you hit my daughter, though that is something you will answer for separately. I did this because when I looked at you across that table, 31 years of experience told me that a man who treats his family the way you do does not treat his business honestly either." I was right. I'm usually right. That's why I lasted 31 years. He said, "You've destroyed my life." I said, "You built something on a dishonest foundation, and you treated the people around you as instruments." I didn't destroy anything. I just stopped holding the flashlight away from it. He hung up. I went inside and poured myself a second cup of coffee. What happened over the following 6 weeks moved at the pace of institutions. which is to say slowly and then all at once. The Tennessee Department of Revenue opened a formal audit of all 4 Westin restaurant locations. The audit, once it began, took on its own momentum. Auditors found irregularities that led to additional document requests, which led to the involvement of a state investigator who specialized in hospitality tax cases. Gary's contact had been thorough in his referral. Darnell's case moved separately, but in a direction that was not good for Travis. The employment attorney Gary had connected him with filed a formal wrongful termination suit that included, in its supporting documentation, the health code concerns Darnell had originally raised. The Knoxville Health Department, seeing this documentation in a public filing, opened its own inspection. The inspection found problems, not catastrophic ones, but the kind that generate citations and require remediation, and, more relevantly, the kind that generate local news coverage when they involve a moderately prominent local restaurant group. The story ran in the Knoxville paper on a Wednesday, a brief piece, not front page, but the kind of thing that appears in a Google search. By Friday, 2 of Travis's catering contracts, a corporate client and a recurring university event, had sent notices of non-renewal. The landlord negotiations for the 5th location, which had stalled for reasons Travis had misrepresented to Megan, became relevant again when the landlord's attorney filed a civil complaint alleging the fraudulent revenue documentation. Travis's attorney apparently advised him that fighting this complaint while simultaneously managing the state audit and the employment litigation was not a position he wanted to be in. Travis's attorney was correct. Megan and Patricia finalized the separation agreement in the 3rd week of December. The agreement was not, Patricia told me later, easy to reach. Travis's attorney pushed back on several points. But the documentation Megan had, the statement she'd photographed 6 weeks before Thanksgiving, the paper trail Patricia had built, and the weight of an ongoing state audit that created enormous pressure on Travis's ability to claim financial stability, meant that the negotiating leverage sat entirely on Megan's side of the table. Megan received the house, sole custody of Sophie, with a structured visitation schedule, a financial settlement that reflected her contribution to the marriage and her portion of the joint assets, and a formal legal acknowledgement, which Travis's attorney had fought hardest against and ultimately lost, of the Thanksgiving incident which was relevant to the custody terms. Travis retained 2 of the 4 restaurants. The other 2 were liquidated as part of satisfying the state's findings. The 5th location was formally abandoned. The empire, such as it was, had been reduced to something much more modest, carrying the weight of an audit, a civil complaint, and a reputation in the Knoxville business community that would not recover quickly. The week before Christmas, Megan and Sophie came to stay with us for 4 days. Linda made her cornbread stuffing, the original recipe, with a full measure of sage, and Sophie helped her the way Megan used to when she was small, standing on a step stool and stirring things with complete seriousness. On the 2nd evening, Megan and I sat on the back porch after Sophie was in bed. It was cold, but not unreasonably so, and we had blankets. She had a mug of tea. I had coffee. She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. She said, "Did you know? When you made the call that night, did you know you'd find what you found, or were you hoping?" I said, I knew the kind of man he was. I didn't know the specifics. But in 31 years, I never once investigated someone I read the way I read Travis and came up empty. The details change, the pattern doesn't. She looked out at the backyard. She said, "I knew something was wrong with the accounts. I'd known for months. I kept telling myself there was an explanation." I said, "That's what people do with someone they love. You look for the explanation that lets you keep loving them. There's no shame in that." She said, "I should have come to you sooner." I said, "You came when you were ready. And you stayed, and Sophie was safe. And when it mattered, you didn't cover for him. That's not nothing." She leaned her head on my shoulder the way she used to when she was a little girl, and we'd sit out here in the summer. Sophie's age, maybe. Before she had any idea that life could hold the kind of weight she'd been carrying for the last 4 years, I thought about the moment at the Thanksgiving table, the sound, the stillness of the room, Sophie's face. I thought about Gary Paulson, who had spent his holiday weekend beginning to pull a thread I'd handed him, Not because I'd asked him to do anything questionable, but because what I'd found was real. And he'd spent his career caring about exactly that kind of thing. I thought about Darnell, who had done the right thing 14 months ago and been punished for it, and who was now going to be compensated for it. I thought about the men and women I'd worked alongside for 3 decades, who believed what I believe, that most people who do wrong believe they've built something solid enough to last. They believe that because no one has looked yet, the looking, when it finally comes, just reveals what was always there. I didn't do anything to Travis Weston that Travis Weston hadn't done to himself. One decision at a time, across years of believing the rules were for other people. I made one call to a man I trusted. Everything, after that, was already there, waiting to be found. Sophie came out onto the porch in her pajamas, dragging a blanket, claiming she couldn't sleep. Megan pulled her into her lap and wrapped the blanket around both of them. Sophie said it was cold, and Megan said yes and pulled her closer. I looked at the two of them. That's the thing about being a father and a grandfather, that no one tells you when you're young and you think strength is about what you're willing to do. Real strength is knowing what you're protecting, and refusing to protect anything less than that. Travis Weston had 4 restaurants and a reputation and a plan for a 5th location. I had my daughter and my granddaughter on my porch in December, and the particular quiet of a family that had come through something hard and was still, despite everything, whole. I knew which one of us had built something that would last,